Hi everyone, welcome to episode 1 of UNICEF at UCLA's podcast. This podcast is focusing on the mental health impacts of the current immigration problem that is occurring at the southern border. I'm here with Professor Lauren Eng, who's going to share her expertise with us today. We'd just like you to please introduce yourself to us and tell us about the research that you do, especially in terms of how it relates to immigrant and minority mental health in the US and beyond.
My research focuses on communities and families and individuals affected by trauma or adverse events, kind of broadly defined. But I have a specific interest in communities affected by sort of mass violence as well as community violence. So that could be anything from genocide to sort of unstable neighborhoods or neighborhoods that are disproportionately affected by community violence or are underserved with respect to resources. I do a lot of research with racial ethnic minority populations, both here in the US and internationally. And I look at specifically treatments and how treatments can be developed that are actually accessible to the populations they're intended to serve, both in terms of sort of logistics and accessibility, transportation, cost, those types of things, but also in terms of what's culturally and contextually appropriate and acceptable to the populations.
So our second question is, how do you think the government, specifically in the United States, can start to resolve their failures and to support immigrants, especially children, during this COVID-19 pandemic and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, in the last several years, there's been huge amounts of policy changes that have specifically targeted the immigrant populations and specifically targeted children and families who are already really vulnerable to trauma effects, and for the most part have arrived at the border because they're trying to flee those types of traumatic events in their homeland. Then they also experience traumatic events on the way to coming to the United States, and now are experiencing even more distress at the border, sort of being forced into these very dangerous situations of kind of being either confined in essentially prisons here in the United States or across the border, or are being forced back across the border or told to return to very dangerous situations. And all of those sort of, what we know about each individual trauma is that alone can lead to poor mental health, but the combined effects of multiple traumas and chronic stressors overall leads to even more distress. And it's not just post-traumatic stress disorder, it can also be depression and anxiety, substance misuse, externalizing problems. And so you're sort of creating this cycle of distress and vulnerability for people. And then asking them while they're in this very distressed state to sort of defend their reasons for coming to the United States, which, as you might imagine, does not often end well for the individuals sort of forced into that situation. And it's not just those individuals coming across the southern border, although of course it's a huge humanitarian crisis, but it's also all the individuals who are waiting in their country of origin, who have refugee status and were told that they might be admitted, who are not being admitted, families separated for other immigration related concerns, not being allowed to enter the United States, asylum seekers trying to get in, on airplanes, not being allowed in. So it's a multitude of challenges that people are facing who are trying to secure safety for themselves and their loved ones, and then arriving here even more traumatized from that entire process, which can be and is often years long.
Why do you think that there's an increased trend, or you might say phenomena, in deportation and detention of immigrants? And how do you think, in your opinion, the laws that are being implemented by the government are going to affect the future of immigrant children who don't have anywhere to go?
So the first question about why is there this increase, I mean, I think those are policy related questions, and I think span a number of different reasons that's sort of beyond my specific expertise. I could posit upon them, but I'll focus more on the effects on mental health of the youth. And so, what we know in general of children separated from their parents or worried about their parents, and that could be children who have a family member that's incarcerated, for example, parents who have died or are, unable for whatever reason to reunite with their children, that in general, those children are going to struggle more and are going to be less likely to have the protective factors that may help them adjust to those positive experiences. So parents are not only sort of critical for the mental health of the child just in terms of the relationship itself, but also all of the resources that they provide to that child in terms of a secure environment, good education, access to good food and water and all of those other things, shelter, that they may not, many of these youth are sort of denied. They're in precarious situations, maybe with people who don't really care about them or don't have their best interests at heart, or maybe in fact preying upon them. And so you have the loss, the sort of interpersonal loss of the parent, the loss of the opportunity to learn from that parent, and then the loss of all of those protective resources for a lot of children. Now, many of them may end up in situations where they are protected in some way, maybe by other family members or friends. However, many of the members of those communities too are fearful for their own immigration status, putting more stress upon the family, and may have to take upon more responsibilities than they really have the resources to provide for. And youth can very much feel that and be aware of those stressors as well, which sort of compounds their own sense of insecurity. And maybe they start to feel like they may be burdening their family members, which also creates higher risk for depression, anxiety, other disorders.
How will the recent events affect the short-term and long-term mental health of the migrant children involved? Will this have a significant impact on the future generations as well?
Yeah, so there is research on sort of intergenerational transmission of trauma, and it occurs, as we've mentioned, through these multiple different pathways in the individual themselves, in terms of their own mental health, their own sense of themselves as an individual who's loved and accepted and appreciated, not only from their family, but also the community at large. So individuals who are experiencing discrimination and who feel very rejected by the community are going to have a much harder time being able to address their own mental health concerns and the needs of their own children and their community. So it's the person's own individual sense of self, but also the resources, again, that they have or don't have access to. Oftentimes immigrants end up having to move to communities that are themselves not safe and are not well resourced, and so sort of get isolated off into maybe very unsafe jobs, for example, in the meatpacking industry or factory work, where they're taken advantage of and preyed upon there. And so their children also have to bear the brunt of experiencing those stressful situations and worrying about their parents going into those types of environments. And then the parents having to work oftentimes multiple hours, many jobs, being away from home. So all of those things creates this sort of intergenerational stressors that the next generation certainly experiences. And without any type of protective support systems or resources that those families can turn to and feel safe turning to, and that are there in a sustainable way, that will just, that cycle will continue on.